Labadiene. Irachu kadezatesie. Thank you. Welcome to this roundtable. This roundtable is part of the Apache Multiplier event, but it's also at the same time something else. We're going to try and open up a bit the perspective from teacher training more towards the importance of languages, in the plural, in higher education. I want to avoid to be speaking too much because I want my guests to be speaking. So I will ask them to present themselves briefly. And I will ask them to do this in the language they prefer. They're L1, L2, L3, L4, whatever, provided I can understand. But I understand Italian, I understand French, so it should work. Portuguese a bit, but we'll do it. Ok. Enrica Piccardo, benvenuta. Prego.
Buongiorno, mi chiamo Enrica Piccardo e sono professore ordinario all'Università di Toronto, all'Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, which is part of the University of Toronto, ma sono anche collaboratrice con il Consiglio d'Europa. I've been working with the Council of Europe for several years now, and I'm one of the authors of the new co-authors, of the new CFR companion volume. So the recent tool that should help us move further with dealing with plurilingualism. I myself, I speak multiple languages, and I'm very interested in languages as phenomena, as a way of communicating around the world.
Grazie. Thank you. Thank you. Our second guest, François.
Merci, dank u wel.
That was Dutch. C'est du néerlandais.
Alors, mon nom est François Grin. Je suis professeur. Alors, c'est très particulier parce que je suis professeur d'économie dans une faculté de traduction. L'idée étant que les traducteurs, qui souvent vont traduire des textes économiques, doivent comprendre non seulement la forme, mais le fond. Donc j'enseigne l'économie à des futurs traducteurs, mais à côté de ça, je tâche d'appliquer l'économie à des questions de multilinguisme, politique linguistique, etc. Donc je suis un mélange de 2-3 choses différentes. Voilà.
Do you need some translation into English? Did everyone understand? It works! It works, ça marche! Wait a little. Now, presenting from our own Apache team, Celio.
Boa tarde. Sou Manuel Celio Conceição, sou professor de Ciências da Linguagem na Universidade do Algarve, em Portugal. Trabalho na área das políticas linguísticas e da terminologia. Je travaille beaucoup en réseau européen. Je suis particulièrement ces derniers temps président du réseau de lexicologie, terminologie et traduction de l'Agence universitaire de la francophonie. I've been involved in several European projects, particularly under the European Language Council. I was the past president of this organization. And I'm now involved in the European Alliance of University, particularly in the European University of the Seas, and I'm the responsible of the Science Communication Work Package under this European Alliance of 9 partners. Thank you.
Obrigado. That's about the only word of Portuguese I can pronounce, but okay. Maria Teresa, prego.
Maria Teresa, sono professore ordinario di linguistica francese, Università cattolica del Sacro Cuore, Milano. Alors, et de là, en tant que professeur de français, les rapports avec les organisations françaises institutionnelles m'ont amené à être maintenant secrétaire général du réseau réalitaire, le réseau de terminologie des langues romanes, où il y a 7 langues qui sont parlées, espagnol, catalan, galicien, portugais, italien, roumain, avec les variantes européennes, américaines. Et donc, je pratique, disons, pas toutes ces langues, quand même. And president of European Language Council nowadays, in these years, so collaborating with other colleagues who are here, and in the Apache project. And I think that the objectives are sometimes in my research, above all, terminological studies and languages for specific purposes as a whole.
Grazie. Mijn naam is Kris Peeters. Ik ben professor in Franse literatuur aan de Universiteit Antwerpen in België. En ik ben onder andere ook lid van het Apache-team en ook lid van de European Language Council. A bit more difficult there, probably, but I'm sure you grasped the essence. This was Dutch. If I had asked you before, do you speak Dutch? What would you have said? Not a word! And it's true, you can't speak it. But there is stuff you can understand. So, as of today, Dutch is in your plurilingual repertoire. Just a little bit, but it's in there. And I made that happen. Yes. So, for this roundtable, my idea was, I'm just explaining to the audience, the participants already know, my idea was very briefly that we try to use the structure of the Apache project, which is a simple threefold structure. What is it that we're talking about? Why do we need to talk about this? And how can we use multiple languages in higher education, either in language or in subject courses, non-language courses, but they also use language, of course. So that's the whole idea. So my first question that I would like to put to the panel is, what is it precisely that we are talking about? If you look at our title, it's the importance of languages in higher education. So what is that importance? What do we mean by languages in higher education? What precisely is it that you think the audience needs to know about languages and their importance in higher education? Enrica.
Should I start?
Please do.
Okay. Languages in higher education, languages in the plural, are a core aspect that is often neglected for its importance. So I think that the what we are talking about is related to the fact that linguistic diversity is a reality and something that needs to be fostered and protected. First of all, protected, I think, and then fostered, but also valued. And this is not necessarily the case at all levels of school. When there are pressures to teach content and a big push to internationalization, there is a tendency to go towards the quick fix, and the quick fix seems to be English. And in that process, so much is lost. So what we're talking about here is how to be aware, first of all, of the importance of having multiple thinking tools, which are the languages, to discuss the different contents and disciplines and to access knowledge that has been created in different contexts and in different languages. So how to protect this biodiversity, which a diversity of languages and cultures enables at all levels, all the way to higher university. And I think that I like saying that plurilingualism is a way of being, is not just a tool, is not just having multiple languages, which certainly helps a lot, but it's also an attitude towards linguistic diversity and the diversity that is implied in all forms of knowledge. So I think that as the first step, don't want to...
One of the things I just heard Enrica explaining, François, immediately makes me think of you. I heard the word, or the sentence, the idea, that this linguistic diversity, biodiversity of languages, multiplicity of languages is not sufficiently valued. Could you say something more about this?
Sure. Okay, well, as I've tried to, for those of you who were present this morning, I tried to focus or start out from the idea that it's important to realize, and in order to realize, to identify and measure ways in which linguistic diversity is beneficial, directly, materially, indirectly, symbolically. And for all those, we have a lot of converging evidence to the effect that, by and large, linguistic diversity is preferable to uniformity. Now, the problem is that at the same time, as Kris has just said, echoing Enrica's words, we see that in the world of academia, in the university world, this diversity is, I wouldn't say under attack, but it's under threat. And this raises a very interesting question, at least from an economic standpoint. Namely, if something is good, if something is valuable, people don't need to be told that it's good and valuable. They usually realize it by themselves, right? So why do we have this situation? It's probably because language and linguistic diversity, a little bit like the natural environment, is a complex commodity. And the valuation of this complex commodity is something that takes a little bit of a more involved way in order to identify and to measure why it is valuable. So this means, and I'm just going to sketch this out in very generic terms so we can come back to it later. This means that, first of all, we have to more closely understand so that we can diagnose what is happening exactly. Why is it that societies, groups, in particular what we call meso-level actors like organizations, companies, universities, why is it that even though it is beneficial for individual persons and for societies as a whole, that's not too difficult to show that diversity is better than uniformity, why do these meso-level actors, including universities, why are they, in a sense, out of step with this valuation? And here we hit upon some, I would call them systemic effects that I can come back to later. And I think one of the important things that we have to do is to think about those systemic effects, think about the motivations of meso-level actors like universities in order to be able to locate exactly the points where we can possibly adopt specific policies, possibly countervailing measures in order to create the, not so much, obligations sometimes, yes, but also simply an incentive structure so that meso-level actors understand and find it in their own interest to go in the direction of preserving this valuable diversity. I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you. Thank you. Maria Teresa, what do you think our audience needs to know about the importance of languages in higher education?
Well, I think above all in higher education we like languages as a whole, and I think it's not so difficult to convince students, perhaps. It's much more difficult to convince policymakers and convince the governance of universities about this, about multilingualism, I mean, to have the teaching and learning and usage of many languages and not just one language, and more than the national language, sometimes the lingua franca. And I should say not only English, I mean in other continents can be other languages. So, but it can be reasonable in terms of effect. And because we think that it's simpler, we think that it's clearer, but in fact we don't consider that this is not the reality, because the reality is multilingual, is plurilingual, and what I can observe is that students are much more aware of this than we think about. And we were teaching about this, we're speaking about this, I think, chatting in between us, about the fact, for example, nowadays in the economic realities, if we have a portfolio with many languages, is very interesting for everyone. So students can understand immediately this, and they have even the idea that we don't need the best level for every languages, but have different level inside. So what I'm not worried. I'm happy about this, about that. Future generations are really open. They are open-minded considering languages, and perhaps we have to learn from young people and answer this about these options and these opportunities. They are underlined and they are conscious and responsible of. So we have perhaps to learn how to negotiate more the presence of languages in higher education with our governances. That's what I think. That's a European problem or European reality, and convincing that more is better than just the old monolingualism and the post-monolingualism, or the fact of having just obliging to publish, to have the research, to have all the institutional communication in a lingua franca. But why not, even if I can understand, well, intercomprehension you can't do, it's difficult to make, to use intercomprehension for any language. But why not? But why not? Because sometimes, if just you say some words to someone of another language, you can build bridges and just have ideas that even if you don't know language, you can know anyway culture. And this is a principle that's very important. And I think that we have to learn from young people and young generations that they are really aware of this, because they have an extremely possibility of access to languages through even artificial intelligence.
Okay. I'm hearing a lot of words that I want to go back to later on. Celio, can I ask you a difficult question? I know I can, that's why I'm doing it. François was speaking about the impact of systemic effects at the meso level, universities for instance, on this lack of attention for the value of linguistic diversity. And then I hear Maria Teresa speaking about policy making. Could you say something about policy making and those effects? What are those effects, and what can policy making change?
Well, yes,
because I know that's your field of expertise. That's why
I try. I don't have the solution, unfortunately.
No, of course.
I've become rich, but I don't have the solution. Well, I think before answering, and then you'll make me the question again if I forget. But I think we need to change our conception of what I'm a linguist. I do apologize for it. But being a linguist, I think we need to rethink about the conception and the representation of what is a language. And that's it may be the problem, because we have been trained to learn a language as a structure. And now we have this conception of a language as a practice, as an emerging practice. So in our context, language, in the education context, for governance, language is just the code you use to transmit something. For our political makers, they don't take care about language. They take care about chemistry, medicine, mathematics, architecture. But there we have knowledge. But language, well, you are supposed to speak it and to use it. That's the wrong way. So the first question, perhaps the bridge among is to understand that we need language to access, build, transmit, disseminate knowledge. So knowledge is not a part out of language. Knowledge, well, knowledge is built within language. So I think it's perhaps an important thing that be sure that language is not a subject apart from other subjects. It's within others. So this change on an epistemological point of view about languages, will take time to do it. Well, perhaps we talk a lot about ecology and ecosystems and so on. It was the same if you made, a wrong comparison, but 20 years ago, who cares about the quality of the air, of water, of the diversity in nature? And then it becomes a real need for us. Perhaps we'll live there somewhere. So this question of the language as and linked to knowledge, and this idea of, at an individual level, as someone says, remember, the question of an ethos, something that I can identify myself as being, what does it mean to be plurilingual? It's not because I can speak different languages, my colleagues, but because I can see their own perspective according to their own discursivity agency and their representation of the language. I know it seems to be theoretical, but it's the real thing how to reflect about the use of languages. Because if you have this idea, and I finish, this idea of language that we have a code and we translate it in another code, that's clear. I have a word and translate it in another word. Well, this is not language. This is industry, it's whatever. But the thing is, when we are talking about language, we are talking about representations, context-driven situation, perceptions, positionnement. So the first thing that we were joking this morning, and I was saying that, it is recording, but I say it. The real enemies of multilingualism are language teachers, because they are trained from it as in a monolingual way of life. But for example, if you work with colleagues from other areas, and I know in the laboratory they have a lot of practical experiences in biology, and they have international students. We work a lot of them. And we try to describe also their practices. You can say they give the instructions in English. Okay, perfect. But then you have some Romance, Spanish, Portuguese students in one group, and then we have some African students, and Africa is another world, but some African students, French, common lingua franca among them, and then they use their own language when building knowledge. So the question in this case is to be sure what we mean by language. Is it to... I really appreciate this idea of multilingual norms. This is from our colleague, I don't know the name. So the idea of multilingual norm, that not a linguistic norm, but a multilingual norm. I know, for linguistic, for purism, it's unacceptable. But that's life. I'm going to answer your question.
Can I add something to what he said? I think you touched really a core point. I tried to go to that when I said that languages are not different labels that you put on the same identical thing, because knowledge is constructed differently in different languages. So if the students are deprived of access to knowledge in different languages, they are basically deprived of tools to construct the knowledge, not only to understand, but also really to construct. And the fact that plurilingualism, in one presentation somebody today said, is linked to mediation, is a tool, but is really core, because it's through this mediating process across and within different languages that you get to a deeper level of knowledge, of understanding, and possibly later a kind of change in mindset, because I think that's the other word that we need to highlight. You know? It's really a change in mindset. Sometimes I wonder if they don't understand the value, to go back to what François was saying, or if it is from an economic point of view, and you're the specialist, like less expensive to pretend that you don't understand the value because you go with the easy fix, you know? I asked myself this question.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. No, I think that the reason that very many meso-level institutions tend to be drawn towards uniformity, and let me insist, this has already been said, but I think it's important to emphasize the point that the problem is not English per se. The problem would be exactly the same if French or Italian or Portuguese or Lithuanian were in a hegemonic position. The problem is linguistic hegemony, right? Now, the reason why meso-level institutions are drawn towards hegemony is, well, there are manifold. It's not the reasons. The reasons. First of all, I think there is a sort of general atmosphere, and that possibly echoes your concern, Enrica, namely that as part of this general atmosphere, we are confronted with what Roland Barthes, you may remember the structuralist, called the encratic language. An encratic language is one that presents itself as self-evident. So we are confronted with the notion of, well, we're confronted with a type of discourse that presents itself as, well, obviously it is easier, obviously it is the best solution to operate with a hegemonic language. Now, why does this work? It probably combines or meshes with other things, and then you can draw on perspectives on language that bank on the concept of alienation. So Henri Gobert, Xavier Durand, to some extent our colleague Robert Philipson, who we're talking about. There are all kinds of cliches associated with this, you know, the notion that, oh, an international education is necessarily in English, or if you want to attract international students and the best students, you have to teach in English. So all these things combine in creating a sort of background noise, which probably warps perceptions a little and places people in a certain, well, people, decision makers at universities in particular, it places them in such a situation where it's kind of like the easy thing to do. It's the path of least resistance, right? But beyond this, I think we can identify a couple of important structural forces, and I'd like to mention two. One of them is this very nifty combination of processes that has been put forward by someone called Philippe van Parijs, Belgian guy, whom I know well because he was in my PhD committee many years ago. Actually, my PhD was not about language at all. And back then, Philippe van Parijs was not working about language at all. We've remained friends. And then he started working on language. I did as well. And he's immensely famous. So I'm just a very junior by comparison, right? And Philippe came up with a perception of language that, on this one, I have to tell him, well, hey, you know, we disagree. We're still very good friends, but on that one, we disagree. Now, there is something interesting in what he says. It's the sort of dual mechanism of minimum exclusion and probability-sensitive learning. Minimum exclusion means that, according to his theory, when people from different linguistic backgrounds get together, there is going to be an internal dynamics which sort of pushes the group of people to adopt the language in which the competence level of the least competent of the persons present is going to be the least low. Make sense? Right. So, and now it means that if it tends to be one particular hegemonic language, like English, then people will generally, in multilingual groups, drift towards English. Now, the second side of the mechanism kicks in, and it's called probability-sensitive learning. When people think about, what language am I going to study? What language am I going to invest in? They will often be drawn to the language which they expect to be using most often, precisely because of the minimum exclusion process. So these two things reinforce each other. To some extent, I think this is quite right. This is quite true. However, of course, it's a bit short because it ignores issues of culture, it ignores issues of power, but it's something that has to be reckoned with. We have to take this into account, and I think this is one of the important systemic or structural, so almost the same, effects that we need to build into our thinking about, well, what do we do to highlight the importance in the long term of preserving linguistic diversity? Now, there is another thing, and that is probably closer to the practical concerns that many people have when they are involved in university administration, is that there is a specific rationality for universities which is subjected to all kind of uniformizing constraints. And essentially, I'd like to highlight two. One of them is that university administrators, chancellors, presidents, rectors, etc., are under quite a lot of pressure to assert the value of their university internationally. And the proof of this is how many international students you can get. And because of the cliche mentioned before that the best students are those you attract with English, and there is a bit of a fantasy about, students who come from usually from faraway countries in Asia. And they are, of course, much brighter than our students. And of course, they are only interested in English. They will never come to learn small languages like Italian or German. Right? So you only attract them with English. And because they're under such pressure to attract people from the outside, they have an incentive to offer or to support the creation of programs operating through the medium of English. Another thing is the operations of funding agencies. The same people are under pressure to make sure that people in the institutions, all of us around the table, that we bring in money from various funding agencies. And what do these funding agencies do? They have to project an international image as well. So they have evaluators from all over. And the excuse is that, you have to submit all your proposals in English because our evaluators do not necessarily know a small inconsequential language like Italian or French or German, right? So you have to produce things in English. And then the same, in an oblique, indirect way, the same kind of mechanism kicks in. And if you take in just, these various structural effects or systemic effects, I think we have, much of the, I think we can capture quite a fair share of the dynamics that lead us into that sort of funnel, this monolingual funnel, which I think all agree is deleterious. And again, I think it is in terms of incentives that we have to take countervailing measures. I've got, I think, a dozen of them, but I'll keep them for later.
Wonderful. Okay. Yeah, of course, please do. Please do.
I was just thinking that we had this, the reality is like this, so in lingua franca everywhere, but in fact we have to learn from the past. And just example cited by Celio in another session about what's happened in the 18th century. Because, for example, there was the creation of the new chemistry, but these concepts were created in one national language, French. But for the new creation of new concepts, a new language was created as well. So there was new terminology and new concepts from Latin, Greek roots coming up into French. But what was the phenomenon? That immediately there was the translation of these new concepts in all European languages and more than this. Of course, 3 centuries ago, but at the beginning of the 20th century, for example, there is the example of the quantum physics, where the concepts were taught in many European languages. So German, Einstein, then English, Rourke, and then back to the national languages, because colleagues have to teach these fields and explain these subjects in their national languages. So, for example, there is the Italian tradition about physics and in this field. So, why do we think that now is not like this? Because now we have these international needs, and so you have to do anything in English, or else I work with French tradition and culture, so I have to do this in French. I can't write in Italian anymore. But in fact, there is one point where I can't eliminate. I think the communication of science in my country. So I have to transfer knowledge anyway, in some way, in Italian as well, if I want to write for Italian people, at a certain stage, I have to speak Italian about these contents. And this is the same everywhere because medicine is like this. So you have the international communication, and that can be in English everywhere, so it's perfect. But anyway, you have patients, and with patients, you can't speak English everywhere. So I think that the fact, this is another point of reality, the communication of science, and you have to do in any languages, and COVID, and with the pandemic, we saw this. And what was interesting, it was about some experiences about terminology, for example, I think that it was in Senegal, a translator was asked to prepare a glossary of term of the pandemic for the use of the government, and this guy used a Canadian glossary, and he discovered that even the terminology in French, in English, was not useful, not all of this terminology, for its own, for the needs of the population. So that's mean that we can't eliminate the languages in their realities, because anyway, we have to communicate all what's important for the government, what's important for medicine, what's important for science. So we can't eliminate languages anyway, or think about that just one international language is enough. It can be enough in editing, perhaps, in communication of research at a certain point, but it's necessary to have the dissemination and transfer knowledge we can do without.
Please.
No. Go ahead.
No, I just want to stress this question, and so with some examples, if you allow me, this question of the question of the impact. I think our institutions, at least in the context where I live in, institutions and representatives of institutions are more and more aware of this need of the local impact. In the past years, we have this idea, as François said, the idea of international impact, attract international students. It is still again, at least in Portugal also. But in Portugal, we have this idea to attract international students from Portuguese-speaking countries, from other continents, then we teach them in English. And in some cases, they don't have any idea of English. To be sure, in Brazil, in the public system in Brazil, they have 1 year of English, and the exam is in Portuguese. But then when we come in Portugal as international students, we teach them in English. But it's another question. But we have this idea, there's the question of internationalization as a need. But no, more and more, and according also, because we have as with you this morning, the emergence of more nationalities and the emergence of the feeling of national. So institutions are more and more aware of the local impact at international level. And the local impact has to be diverse, linguistically diverse. So I think it's an important thing. And now they ask us, of course, to publish in international journals and so on, but even in our internal quality criteria for evaluation, of my evaluation, for evaluation, they also take care about what we do in to provoke the local impact. And this idea of this European, probably it calls the third mission, la terza missione in Italy, it's a very important thing. It's an Italian concept, but spread over Europe now. And this idea of the European, the engagement, university engagement, the strategy 2030, the local engagement. And I think it's very important. And also this idea of, and this, I think, even this European Alliance, I think this will help to avoid what we in terminology called terminology loss in some domains. But because now we need to have terminology gain and to create terminology in local, regional languages to express the research that has been published at international level in English. So I think things are changing. And the good example we have, as you told me this example, the journal Nature, the very important Nature, that now is published in different European language. Of course, they don't recruit translators, they do it by automatic translation. But it is published in Italian and in Portuguese, and two Portuguese of Portugal and Portuguese of Brazil. So we can say, why need Nature to make a publication in Portuguese? Because Nature in English is perfect, it's the best one. But they feel the need to put in other languages. So I think things are a little bit changing. I hope at least. Perhaps I'm wrong.
It depends where.
Yeah, of course. Now, of course.
If I may, I'm a bit less optimistic than my colleagues.
Not optimistic.
And also, I don't think it's the dominant language, any language. I think it's a real problem of English. I think that we see a mechanism around the world where a system has been put in place where researchers are judged on the basis of the impact of their work. Students, my PhD students, we discuss this problem very often. They know that if they write in English, they will be cited more. So this is something that they don't like. So how can we cope with that? And I always say, well, you have to be realistic. There is a phase, I understand, in your career where you might have to go with the flow, like publish in English, but don't forget that there is a lot you can do afterwards. There is a form of activism that we should have in trying to publish, because what you say is basically knowledge that has been created in English and then has been transferred into other languages for scope of bringing it closer to people. I don't think it's the same thing. No. I think it's important to, like, if I understand correctly, you come from Belgium, but Belgium is probably different. But I know from colleagues originally from Denmark. In Denmark, they tend not to publish anymore in Danish. They go directly with English.
The Netherlands is a good example as well, I think.
And the Netherlands is coming close.
And Belgium as well.
And, you know, because they are relatively small languages. So I don't think we should be fooled by the fact that French is still a very big and powerful language. German is a big and powerful language. Spanish, for sure. But it's a tendency that we see. I think that we have to see in an ecological way. Now they are local languages. Local languages are disappearing. But there is a big problem that certain local languages will never reach the point in which they will produce academic knowledge. Think of African languages, for example. If we continue this tendency, they will they will stay just as languages to be spoken in the family at the level of the community period. So this movement that we have seen in different languages to produce literature, produce academic knowledge, might not even happen for certain language if English is so pervasive. And I think we should not forget that there is an elephant in the room here, and the elephant is speaking English. Yeah.
Of course, I agree.
This is a fantastic round table because I don't have to do anything. I just have to mind the timing. Do you want to answer?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, go ahead. No, go ahead.
I was going to get you off the hook another time.
Okay, good.
No, because I'm sort of, I think it's in Japanese, they say choto chigaimasu. I sort of vaguely allow myself not to fully agree with you. Yes. That's a very nice way of saying it. So, choto chigaimasu. And because I think it's important to have a typology of the uses of languages by universities. Then, of course, and there was such a typology in the list that you sent us before this roundtable. Yeah. For example, what languages are taught at a university as subjects, and we've heard that this university teaches about 30. Is it right? Yeah. Now there are the language or languages used as mediums of modes of mediums of instruction, language in research, and there I think it's important to refine the typology, break it up and slice it up a bit further between the everyday work of research in your lab with your team, which mostly takes place in the local language. Right, and then a different matter is what you do with the international communication of your results. And right now I'm using English because we're sharing together. And okay, it would be more fun to do this in Lithuanian, but I can't, right? So I'm okay with this idea of, for this purpose, to use a more hegemonic language, because hey, perhaps it would be better to do it in Esperanto. There would be all kinds of arguments for this, at least economic ones. Economically, it would be a far better solution, but then it's difficult to implement. Then there is another thing, which is the local dissemination of your results for regional audiences, what we sometimes call service à la cité. It's I think a similar concept to the one. C'est à la société. D'accord, pour nous c'est la cité. Voilà. It sounds very, ancient Greece type of thing, right?
It sounds very Jean-Jacques Rousseau.
Well, could be, yeah, exactly. and then there is something which I think I increasingly think is important, which is the language of administration and internal communication. And let me just tell you a little story. I just wrote the other day to one of the vice-rectors who heads a committee called La Commission de Politique des Langues, the Language Policy Commission of the university, and I'm a member of this committee. I wrote to her to complain and say, I want this to be on the to be discussed at our next meeting. Namely, we are receiving internal information from some internal competence at the university in English, and not just in English only, which I think is unacceptable. And I was wondering, Namita, when you were talking earlier, would this be allowed under the internal policy of your university?
English only?
No. Well, I'll quote you as an example at that meeting, right?
Not in Belgium either.
Not in Belgium either, but
law.
and of course not in Canada either, right?
No, yeah.
So I think one of the really important problems for the presence of various languages within universities is to make sure that all the internal communication, it doesn't need to exclude English, but it certainly must not be allowed to exclude the local language, big or small. So I think this is really, to me, this is one of the most important, strategically important points. And I think part of the measures that we have to adopt or push for include being extremely watchful in that respect.
Yeah, absolutely.
And just another fact, localization, for example. And you localize products, of course, you can be used by marketing much more than academic researchers, but you have to translate in all the languages and localize and adapt to different cultures. And this is so. I don't mention any trademarks or else, but just think that is reality. If you think of the variety of products we can buy everywhere, and the use of artificial intelligence for immediate translation, and perhaps, it's not be used for academic or scientific communication. But that back to this point. There is another trend nowadays, even in, British or American journals, for example, asking not only for abstracts in many languages, but even articles in many languages, because the fact of monolingualism is not an interest. It's not a real interest. So I can recognize that there is some, in some fields, for some subjects, there is some attitudes, and you have the idea that it's like this, that there is a monopoly that is not possible to go back. But the example of this journal, Nature, was underlined, was a scientist that has told us this fact, why Nature, that can communicate everywhere in the world, as now national edition, but not for all languages, because they are not at the moment the edition for French language, but for Italian, yes. And why? The editor explained us that this was because they needed to publish some Italian research, for example, which is not translated, but is good to be known, and perhaps it will be translated. So I think that's an investment in a field which is science, not only medicine, science as a whole, and it's very interesting to see that there is different attitudes, because anyway, we can't eliminate citizenship, so you have to communicate to citizens, so you can eliminate all the languages, or even if you don't use, there will be minorities, and we know that minorities have a great force if they want. So there is minorities, and I can't name anyone, just to think about the role and the force a minority can have to remember their importance of any one language.
I have rapidly. Okay, no, go ahead. Go ahead.
I just want to stress one thing. What is the mission of higher education, in fact? Why do we exist? Higher education mostly is to produce, to create knowledge, to better life or something. If you want to create knowledge, it has an impact. And I think it's an important thing. I saw you as our colleague on for Tarragona, the translation, Anthony Pym. Anthony Pym talk a lot about the trust, the question of the philosophy of trust. So citizens may trust us also because they finance our work, our salaries. So the question of trust cannot be done in a communication they cannot understand. So this, I think you can explore and exploit this idea of trust between institution and society to be sure that this will show the need of multilingualism. We cannot build trust, and we have this example during the pandemic, at least in Portugal, in France, well, not in Italy. Because in Italy they use all the terms in English with the meanings. In the first moment. But even in Portugal, when our high-level specialists try to communicate things that you cannot understand, you just create fears. We're threatened about the idea of this monster and this whatever. When they use words in English, it was clear that people don't trust really, because they try to avoid to explain us something. So it's a question. This idea of building trust in communication, I think it can be elaborate, not now, but elaborate on the way that we need, or to show that we need multilingualism. And I think we can perhaps use it and work on it.
I have a million questions myself, of course. I'm gonna put one on the table, but asking you not to answer it. I'm just wondering how we could convince at least one big academic publisher and use that as a leverage to convince our universities. I don't know.
Can I just give you two examples? Just two examples.
Yes.
You want us not to answer this?
No, I will not answer. I will just do examples.
No, I wanted to give the floor to the audience as well.
Two examples. Liverpool University Press.
Yes.
England.
Yeah.
They publish a journal.
Bilingual.
No. Multilingual.
Ah, super. Good.
The European Journal of Language Policy is a multilingual journal. It started being bilingual, Portuguese and French, and now we are different other language. English and French, of course, another language. Yeah. Peter Lang, it's a huge publisher. Yeah. In some months, there will be a collection on terminology called Terminologie Plurielle, and you'll accept 4 languages. These are examples.
A counterexample, I had a meeting recently
John
with...
Benjamin's.
No, Benjamin's is still okay. I had a meeting with someone from Routledge about publishing a book with them, which basically is a history of French literature from medieval times until the end of the 18th century. We were discussing this, and the first thing he asked was, would you consider writing it in English? And I said, no. And it was the end. No more discussion. So maybe the audience has some questions. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, just to say that we are trying. We have been accepted for having a series called the Routledge Plurilingual Studies, the Routledge Studies in Plurilingualism, and we have said we said, well, we would like also to accept the things that are not just written in English. We didn't have a no like yours, but we said we had a more vague reply. So maybe in a couple of years we can talk.
And answer in Japanese with your word in Japanese.
We can talk again, maybe.
Well, since you've been doing some advertising, I will as well. Language Prompts and Language Planning over the past 4 years has been carrying articles in 6 different languages and abstract in over 30 different languages, including Yoruba, Kurdish, Cornish, Russian, and many European languages. Right?
Super. One of my doctoral students has Yoruba as her L1.
Okay, well,
You see why the colleagues
That's
are
wonderful.
more optimistic than me, because they're
Yeah.
based in Europe. If you're based in North America, you see much more.
I should say there is a lot of investment, for example, in Arabic language, and coming from the Emirates of Sharjah, because there is a great investment on this, and even Saudi Arabia. So it's a sensibility, something.
Things are moving slowly, but they are moving.
They are, for example, translating books from very important European books to this. So that things change.
Do we have any questions from the audience? How much time do we have left, Nimira? Not that much, I think. 10 minutes, maybe? I don't know. 10 minutes. 11, okay. Questions, anyone? Please, don't be shy. Of course, Nimira.
How do you imagine the future of higher education in relation to plurilingualism, the use of plurilingual approaches in higher education? Do you think that we teachers who are working now, or teachers who have been working for and will be working for many, many years, do you think that teachers will accept that approach and continue and learn and will embrace plurilingualism? Or is it just a fad, like a fashion, and it will pass? What is your opinion?
I don't know, but rapidly I want to say something about this myself, very quickly. I don't know, I don't have the solution. But I do know what the problem is. The problem is, if we can't solve it now, students will learn languages in a monolingual way, will become monolingual teachers who will teach their students in a monolingual way, and in 30 years' time we will still have the same problem. So we need somehow to figure out how we can start shaking the tree. So, and maybe taking the roots out of monolingual approaches. I don't know how, I don't have solutions.
I think this time I'm optimistic, because I think that when they discover this way of teaching, they don't go back. I mean, this has been my experience in the different projects. They are sometimes resistant because they see like a mountain in front of them, saying, oh, it's going to be so difficult. Oh, but I have 20 languages in my group. How can I cope? I'm not fluent in maybe in one or two of these other languages. But once they break the ice and they see the results, and it's very often a question of letting go of the control. The main point for the teachers is sharing the responsibility with the students, and really, because we think of this aspect just for primary, junior, secondary, where the teachers, we think, okay, they have to be in control. But no, it's a lot in also at higher level, and it's really throughout this idea that what if they talk about something that is not appropriate? What if they talk about something that I don't understand? And I said, well, you will see that if you open, you will see the results, because they will be engaged in using their own languages to get to better results, and they will be more proud to introduce, to have, they want to give the presence of their own languages even when this is not part of the curriculum. If we broaden up and we use multiple languages also in a intercomprehension way or comparative, that gives them ideas, and they will, as I go back to this idea that is really a mindset for the teacher and for the students. And once you break the ice, you really enjoy. It's not that it's not challenging, it remains challenging, but it's a nice challenge. It's something that teachers want to embrace.
I should say that the role, for example, of language centers and the initiative of having course of languages, even distance learning, but I think it's increasing the demand a lot. So as fictions and television and series, for example, even if you look at them in your own language, you know that they present other world as the films, of course. But this more because you can go back and choose the original language with subtitles. You have much more and more materials, and we are exposed to this, and you can choose. But in fact, we don't have to underestimate the role of language centers in Europe, at least, because they are very active for extracurricular courses. And so this is a chance. And I think that people understand that it's interesting, even have a level A1, A2 level in another language, but it's something they can be interested. And in this aspect, the fact that we were annoying in some period, if we were not ill during the pandemic, and this increased a lot the fact of using distance learning for learning languages, and that's good if it's a starting point.
Maybe the researchers have a lot to do here, like François was telling about research and showing the economic value of that, not only the cognitive or psychological, emotional, or whatever, but its economical value of knowing languages and being able to speak and not trying to achieve that standard language in one or two languages that it was this fashion. So yeah, a lot of social agents are necessary to solve that problem.
But we are shaking that tree. Any other question?
If I may then perhaps react to François, I'm vice rector. You mentioned this administrative level, and I can share one example. Well, the communication at our university is basically in Lithuanian, and then also we add English part so that the international community can cope with it, but that's about 50% of all the communication. So basically the priority is Lithuanian, but the example I wanted to share was we have the mailing list of our staff. Yeah. And basically before I took the office there were two mailing lists. So there was Lithuanian and international. And then I found out the problem that well, the international people do not receive much of information. They complain like, okay, we don't get that. Yeah. And then the communication department says, okay, but that's in Lithuanian, they won't understand. And then the international people say, but while we are trying to learn some Lithuanian, we might understand. A very simple problem. It means a lot for the people who feel isolated. Easy to solve. So those on the optimistic line, those problems sometimes can be solved easily. Just make a common list and send the Lithuanian information to everyone. Let them learn. Let them be welcomed. So that's on the easy note and optimistic note. The pessimistic note is the pressure that François mentioned on that meso level by the macro level. That pressure exists. At least in Lithuania, we have really this very strong regulation by the government on universities. And how you have to publish, how much of different kind of categories of articles you have to have in order to pass your competition. And this is all for us to be pay attention to. When we recruit our staff. So if you do not publish internationally, you cannot just be recruited. So this pressure is there, and the universities have to deal with it.
But it's not only the Lithuanian, this meso level that is pressing. Now we want to become a part of the European community, and how will the university be valued in all those ratings everywhere if the criteria are to publish a lot in English? So I don't know where we have to look for the roots. It's a bit further than Lithuanian macro level. It's just European macro level.
We will not discuss these rankings because there's a lot of things to say about this.
But they are a pressure.
Yes, they're pressure, of
and
course,
they are awful
They decide-
because
yes.
we know what it is.
He receives money for master studies on the basis of the articles published. So, of course, there is no relation.
I think we're really right in the thick of things there. I don't think publishers can be miraculously led to mend their ways unless they respond to something, and they will respond to what? They will respond to where do academics want to publish? And then in turn, where academics want to publish will depend on the conditions for hiring and renewal of academic positions. And this will depend on university rules. And these university rules, in turn, depend on the structure of incentives which are set by governments. And governments, in turn, will respond, at least in democracies, to what public opinion wants. So ultimately, we are in a situation where it is a citizen's responsibility to express their desire to have a truly multilingual environment at universities. And truly multilingual does not necessarily mean a dozen languages everywhere all the time. It may sometimes mean, I'll be very happy with that if it's just not a uniform hegemonic language, just having a local language with, in addition, the presence of other languages. But this means that there must be political pressure, and I think we can be among other things, one thing that we can do, and that's part of service à la cité, is something we can sort of like help shaping this opinion, help this opinion sort of come to terms with this and express itself, so that pressure is put on governments who can then say, all right, well, financing of universities will be withheld for all programs that are exclusively in English. You do not get you get funding for programs or for student enrollment as long as these programs are not English only. And then you can get, of course, as part of your budget, you can claim the salary of various professors as long as you require those professors to have a list of publication that has at least 20% of their publications in a non-hegemonic language. That sort of measures is what we need, because this renews the incentives. I think many universities are not, I don't think that, some people are really, I think, naive and alienated. That exists. But in many cases, I think university officials are not necessarily naive or alienated. They are just, victims of this kind of a systemic context and the pressures that go along with it. So let's change the context and the pressures so that they can implement measures that will support linguistic diversity also in the curriculum vitae of professors.
As far as I'm concerned, and as far as our timing is concerned, that's a perfect conclusion. Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you. This was the easiest roundtable I've ever moderated.
Thank you. It was difficult to make